a night like many others. The rain was heavy outside, and I was at home, alone, trying to enjoy the peace of the night. There was something comforting about loneliness, especially after a busy week at work. The sound of the storm outside, mixed with the rustling of trees in the garden, gave me a sense of calm. I settled down on the couch, turned on the TV, but soon realized that I could not concentrate. The soft light of the lamp in the corner of the room created shadows on the walls, and each snap of the house made the air heavier, denser. The old house, with its boards creaking every time it moved, always had this effect on me. But that night it looked different, as if the house was alive, breathing, waiting for something. The sound of rain on the roof mixed with the sound coming from inside the house. A low noise, almost imperceptible. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought, or something banging on the windows. But as the sound repeated itself, a strange feeling began to take hold of me. It was a snap, followed by a slight scratch, as if something was moving. The house was in absolute silence, and the sound seemed to come from a distant place, perhaps from the attic. It was not possible. I never heard anything coming from there. It was all locked up since I moved here, and never thought much about that forgotten space on top of the house. But now I couldn't ignore it. I got up from the couch with a growing sense of discomfort. Maybe it was just an animal stuck on the roof or something moving in the air conditioning. But the sound continued, louder, clearer. I stopped for a moment, trying to rationalize. It had been years since I thought about the attic, and until that night, it seemed to be just a part of the house that I never used. The rain outside increased, but the sound coming from the attic seemed sharper, more strange. A louder snap followed by a scratch, as if something was trying to move there. My curiosity began to gain strength, but there was something in it that made me uncomfortable. A cold feeling which went up my spine and made my body tense. The idea of investigating that sound, in that isolated place of the house, did not please me at all. Still, I could not ignore it. Something inside me, a vague feeling that I needed to know what was happening, led me up the stairs. The light in the corridor blinked unnervously as I went up, and the crack in the attic became more pronounced, like an invitation or a provocation. I stood for a moment at the top of the stairs, listening. The air was colder there, and it was then that I realized, for the first time, how dense the silence of the house seemed, as if something was waiting. I took a deep breath and, with my heart beating faster, decided to climb. The old attic door was locked, as always, but the feeling that something was there bothered me so much that, without thinking twice, I took the key that always kept in the kitchen drawer. The key was cold, and as I turned the lock, a muffled noise came from inside, an almost inaudible breath. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, and for a moment all I could hear was my heart beating faster. There was no doubt that something was there. Whatever it was waiting for me. I turned the handle and pushed the attic door. The wood rankled, and I felt a shiver rise up my neck. I didn't know what was waiting for me up there, but something inside of me was already beginning to realize that this night would be different from all the others. The attic was darker than I imagined. The lamps in the corridor, which illuminated the rest of the house, did not reach there, and the darkness seemed to swallow every corner of that muffled space. The only light I had was that coming from my lantern, which trembled in my sweaty hand. The sound of rain outside mixed with the creaking of the planks under my feet, creating an even stranger environment, as if the house was whispering old secrets. I stepped hesitantly into the attic. The air was heavy and hot, in contrast to the cold of the night that invaded the house. There was dust everywhere, and the smell of aged wood filled my lungs. But what bothered me most was silence. The strange sound that had brought me there had ceased, and all that remained was the echo of my own breath. I started walking slowly, pointing the lantern at the old boxes and furniture covered with white sheets. It was the kind of loft I only saw in horror movies, with abandoned things that kept memories of the past, but I did not let myself be carried away by the feeling. I tried to focus on logic, looking for some rational explanation for what was happening. Perhaps some animal had hidden among the things and was trying to get out. It was when the flashlight lit something different, something that wasn't there before. A small wooden box with the lid slightly open. I stopped immediately, my stomach tightening. The box seemed new, or at least it was not part of the old and dusty things that were there. My heart shot, and a feeling of restlessness took hold of me. Why was this box there, and how had it appeared without me noticing? I crouched, hesitant, and pushed the lid with my fingers, which trembled. The wood of the box was aged, but the lid opened easily, as if waiting to be touched. Inside, I found a series of objects that seemed to have been carefully guarded. Yellowed photos, some faded with time, and small personal objects. A leather bracelet, a torn letter, an old watch. All this was there, as if it were a forgotten time capsule, but there was something even more strange in the photos. In one of them, I saw a young woman smiling with a calm expression. I didn't recognize her immediately, but something in those eyes seemed familiar to me, as if I had seen that face somewhere, perhaps in some old news. In the other photos, the woman appeared in different places, always with the same serene expression. But as I looked at the images, something stood out. A place, a building, an old hotel that I knew. A hotel that had been abandoned years ago, after a series of unexplained disappearances. The sense of strangeness increased. I remembered something that I had heard when I was younger. They were talking about a woman who had disappeared in that area years ago. Nobody knew the reason, nor what had happened to her. Some said she was last seen near that hotel. But what surprised me was not only the recognition of the place. It was the feeling that that woman in that picture was somehow connected to me. I turned the box to see the bottom and found more objects. A piece of paper, crumpled, as if it had been torn in a hurry, and inside it, a name, Emily Turner. I frowned. Didn't know who it was, but the name sounded familiar, as if I had heard it somewhere in some distant conversation. When my fingers touched the piece of paper, a cold sensation ran through my body. It was not just the coldness of the damp attic. Something else was happening, as if that box, those objects, were trying to tell me something. Suddenly, I felt a weight in the air, as if being observed. The clap I had heard before had returned, but now it seemed closer, more intense. I stood up quickly, looking around, trying to understand what was happening. The silence had returned, but there was something new in the house now, something that wasn't there before, something that seemed to have awakened with the box, with the objects I had touched. A presence, a feeling that the past and present were mixing, that I was no longer alone there. I looked up at the attic door hesitantly, and then heard it again. The noise. But now it wasn't a snap. It was something else, something moving. I was no longer alone. The air in the attic became denser, as if something invisible had spread there, making the environment uncomfortably heavy. I had the feeling that the objects in the box, with their dusty secrets, had changed something, awakened a force that was dormant until then. My fingers were still shaking, and the lantern, which I held firmly, began to swing, throwing dancing shadows across the walls, as if it wanted to show me something. I put the box back in the corner and slowly moved away, but a strange feeling of being watched grew inside me. There was no more rain outside. All I could hear now was my own breath, gasping and speeding. I turned to get out of the attic, but before I could step, the sound came back, louder, clearer, like light steps, echoing from the other side of the attic. The feeling was unmistakable. Someone was there, moving in the shadows. Terrified, I took a step back, feeling the weight of the presence around me. Every hair on my neck shuddered. The sound was not of something inanimate as I imagined before. It was more alive. I was beginning to understand that what was there was not a simple logical explanation. It was not the wind or an animal. It was something supernatural. My mind began to run, trying to rationalize. But there was something in my chest that told me I wasn't safe. It wasn't just any noise. It was getting more intense, closer. The clap of the steps seemed to move in my direction, until suddenly it stopped. The silence in the house became even more oppressive. I did not dare to move, could hardly breathe, as if the house itself was holding me. My gaze was fixed in the shadows, looking for something, anything that could explain what was happening. But all I saw was darkness, thick and impenetrable. The lantern was shaking in my hand, and that's when I realized that the air around me was colder than before. The heat of my breath seemed to form a mist, while a feeling of weight was squatting on my shoulders, as if something was approaching me. The feeling of being watched intensified. I looked down the corridor on my left, where the stairs went down to the bottom floor, and wondered if I should run away. But something stopped me. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't get out of there, as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to face what was in front of me. The feeling that something was approaching me, or perhaps from within me, became overwhelming. That's when, looking at the box again, I noticed something even stranger. The lid was open. I was sure that I had closed it before I walked away. My heart popped. The box seemed to challenge me, as if she knew I couldn't just ignore it, that I couldn't just leave what was inside of her. The presence was inside that box, inside the objects, inside the photos. Something I still did not understand, but it called me back. Reluctant, with my chest cramped with fear, I went back to the box. But as I got closer, the sound came back louder than ever. It was a crash now, as if something was hitting the inside of the box. Something that shouldn't be there. I wanted to run, but my legs didn't respond. Something stopped me, something held me back. Suddenly, a louder noise, a deaf snap, made the walls of the attic tremble. I turned to the door, and that's when I realized. The shadow at the entrance of the staircase was moving. It was not a natural shade. It was dense, darker than the shadows of the attic. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, and the feeling of dread left me speechless. I didn't know if I was seeing it or if my mind was playing a trick on me, but one thing was certain. Something was there, and I wasn't alone anymore. The shadow advanced without making a sound, slowly approaching me. I wanted to run, get out of there, but my legs were still. The air became even colder, as if the presence approached with a will of its own. And then, a low voice, almost inaudible, appeared in the midst of that oppressive silence. "You found," she whispered. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but one thing was clear. That voice wasn't my imagination. She was there, in the same room as me, like an invisible presence. The box, the photos, the woman in the images, everything was starting to make sense, but what was about to happen, I didn't know. Only knew that something was approaching me, and I was not prepared for what came next. The voice whispered again, now clearer, closer, as if inside my head. "You found?" I couldn't process what was happening. My thoughts were confused, fear was taking over me, but there was something else, something instinctive that told me not to turn away, not to run away. I needed to understand. The shadow was closer now. It did not move like a person, but stretched, distorted, as if formed by a liquid, dark substance that absorbed all the light around it. I did not know if I was seeing clearly or if the fear was making me delirious, but what I felt was real, and it was immense. She was there for me, waiting for me, as if she knew I had touched something that I should not. My hands were cold, sweat running down my face, but I could not turn away from the box, which seemed to pulse as the presence approached. The lantern in my hand was no longer useful. The shadow did not reflect light, and my heart seemed to beat so hard that I could swear she could hear it. Each second seemed to last an eternity. It was then that I remembered the woman in the pictures. Emily Turner, the name echoed in my mind, like a mantra that pulled me into the nightmare. I started to connect the pieces, and connections began to form, even though I was reluctant to accept. Emily Turner, the missing woman, the mysterious disappearance that happened years ago, right there in that city, in that hotel, that box, those objects, everything was connected. But how? Before I could organize my thoughts, the shadow moved towards the box. Felt suffocating. I was caught in a nightmare, no way out. The voice whispered once more, and now it seemed to come from all sides as if I were surrounded. "I never left. You found it." I took a step back, and the ground cracked under my feet, but instead of backing up further, something in me decided to resist. If that was real, I needed to understand what was happening. I wasn't going to run away anymore. I needed to confront it. I needed to know why I was being called there, why that presence wanted something from me. With trembling hands, I took the box and opened it with force, not knowing exactly what I was looking for. The photos were arranged in an order, as if they followed a timeline that I was now beginning to understand. I saw the images of the woman, Emily, and one of them paralyzed me. In that photo she was smiling, but in the background behind her there was a shadow. Not an ordinary shadow, but something I recognized immediately. The same darkness of the presence that was in front of me. She was there in that photo watching Emily. It was as if a wave of understanding had struck me. Emily Turner had not disappeared by accident. It had been consumed, swallowed up by something beyond human comprehension. And that thing, that shadow, was now connected to me, my own presence here. I had found the box, and in doing so, by touching the objects, I had released something that was trapped there in the attic for years. The shadow formed before me, now clearer than ever. I could no longer deny. It was as if he was seeing everything again, as if his own house, the past and the present were colliding. And the voice, Emily's voice, was no longer a whisper. It was a requirement. You found it. Now help me to go. I didn't know what she meant by that. How could I help her? What did she expect from me? But I didn't have time to ask. The shadow advanced, and it was as if the air around me compressed. I felt that I was being swallowed, that everything around me was disintegrating. Then something strange happened. The pictures in the box started to shine, a weak but growing light, and the shadow in front of me flashed. In a rush, I took one of the pictures and held it steady, staring at the shadow. You're stuck with it, aren't you? I said with a firmer voice than I felt. I don't know how, but I won't let it go on. The shadow hesitated. It was a second of silence, a pause where everything seemed to be about to collapse. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how it would end. But at that moment I knew I had to make a decision. The presence in front of me, the box, the woman in the photos, everything was waiting for my choice. I pressed the photo harder. If you want to go away, you'll have to go alone. At that moment, the shadow faded away, not in an explosion, but as if it were a smoke slowly dissipating. The house was silent. The pressure in the air disappeared, and the cold that took hold of me was dissipating. I could no longer hear the voice, and the box in my hand was cold, dull, as if it had lost all the power it had before. I didn't know what that meant, whether or not Emily had been released or if something else had been released. But one thing was certain. The presence, the shadow, was now gone. But the weight of that night would remain in my mind as a distorted memory, a mystery that might never be fully solved. The box was still with me, and I didn't know what to do with it. But whatever it was, I knew my life would never be the same. I have always been someone who appreciates his own company. Perhaps it is the effect of time spent alone, days that passed without significant human contact except for work. My friend said I was a little too reclusive, but I always thought I liked living like this. That changed when I started noticing something strange in the bathroom mirror. It was a morning like any other. I got up early, as always, to take a quick shower before the day began. Wrapped in my plush robe, I looked into the mirror, hoping to see the tired but familiar woman that I always saw. However, something was different. When I rubbed my eyes, I saw that the reflection was not just looking at me. It was imitating me, making gestures slightly different from mine. I shook my head, trying to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination. But as the day went on, I began to realize that the reflection was not just imitating my gestures. He was starting to take over a control that should not have. Small things like smiling when I was serious or raising my eyebrows when I tried to concentrate started happening more often. I couldn't get away from the feeling that this reflection was becoming something more, something wrong. That night, I was tired and decided to relax in front of the mirror while removing makeup. The reflection started laughing, but not a natural laugh. It was a darker, distorted laugh, as if it had a life of its own. I felt a shiver go my spine and quickly washed my face away from the mirror. Was I going crazy? At work, distracted with tasks, even stopped thinking in the mirror for a while. But at night, when I came home, my mind began to wander again. What would happen if I spent more time in front of that mirror? Would my reflex continue to act like this? What if, somehow, it was gaining control? I even thought about covering the mirror with a sheet, as superstitious people do when a loved one dies. But then I thought about how absurd it would be and left it. Still, the idea remained in my head, insistent and unsettling. More and more, I felt like I was not alone in my own home. Time passed, and the reflex behavior continued to worsen. He seemed to be gaining more life, more independence. I tried not to look at him, avoid him at all costs, but there was something hypnotic in his eyes, as if he was challenging me to try to do something about it. It was getting harder and harder to ignore, harder to get rid of the feeling that this reflection was alive. I knew something was wrong, but still tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening. Maybe I'm just too tired, I thought, trying to convince myself that it was all a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But as the days passed, the reflex behavior became more evident and more strange. At first, it was just small differences. A subtle smile when I was sad or an eyebrow lift that made no sense. But over time, the reflex began to act in a bolder way. I could not ignore when, one morning, looking at me in the mirror, he made a gesture with his hand as if he was moving me away, and I just stood there, staring, trying to understand what was happening. He started doing things I would never do, like when I was in front of the mirror to fix my hair and he just stood there, staring at me while I fiddled with the wires. It was then that I realized he wasn't just imitating me. He was watching me as if I were someone else. When I stepped aside, the reflection did not move immediately, as if it was waiting to see what I would do. When I took a second step, he followed the movement but in a slow way, as if it were an exact replica of me, but with a disturbing delay. I was speechless. My body froze. I took a deep breath and tried to rationalize, telling myself that it was just an illusion, that maybe I was just too tired to see the difference. But when I came back to the mirror the next day, the reflection was staring me with an expression that I would never have. His eyes were filled with something I could not name. A malice? An intention? I tried to keep the feeling of dread away. I went into the kitchen, made a cup of coffee, distracted myself with the TV, and tried not to think about what was happening. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me back to the mirror, as if it were impossible to escape from it. More and more, I saw myself looking for the reflection, almost as if being called to observe it, challenging myself to understand what was happening. That night, after a long day of work, I was exhausted. The reflection, as always, was there. But this time, something was different. I was drying myself, and looking in the mirror, he did not imitate me. He made a gesture of his own, as if inviting me to do something. I tried to ignore it, trying to follow my routine, but he wouldn't let me. Whenever I looked in the mirror, he would look back at me with a bewildering smile, as if he was expecting something from me. I started to wonder if the reflection was trying to communicate in some way. I wanted to believe that it was only my mind, that my loneliness was playing tricks on me. But his attitudes were increasingly disconcerting, and I did not know what to do. Every time I saw myself, I felt like I was being watched by a stranger. One night, when I was about to go to bed, I decided to test something. I stared at the reflection and consciously tried to change my behavior. I stood still, without moving for a few seconds, watching him attentively. The reflection, in turn, began to do something that shivered me to the bones. He smiled, not a simple smile, but a crooked smile, almost as if he was enjoying my inability to understand what was happening. And then he made the gesture of touching me, not my reflection touching the glass, but his hand raising, as if he really wanted to touch me, as if it were coming out of the mirror. I felt my body freeze. The reflection was no longer just imitating. It was interacting with me. It was no longer just a shadow of me. He was starting to act independently with a will of his own, and that terrified me. He no longer looked like me, but as a distorted and threatening version of myself. It was at that moment I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Something was beginning to control me, to observe me, to test me. What if he was waiting to take my place? I didn't know what to do. What was happening to me? What was that reflection? And why was he behaving in such a strange, threatening way? The more I tried to drive away the fear, the more it infiltrated my thoughts, until it became a constant presence, heavy, difficult to ignore. I tried to rationalize, still trying to find some logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe it's some kind of psychological disorder, I thought. Maybe I'm just too stressed out or exhausted, or... The sentence seemed empty. There was no more plausible justification. The reflection was not just a hallucination. He was there, and he was starting to gain control. Every time I passed in front of the mirror, my breathing accelerated. I avoided looking directly at him, but could not resist. When I looked, the image in the mirror was staring at me, with a sinister smile that was not mine, with empty eyes of humanity. He was challenging me. He wanted more. He wanted more of me. He wanted more of my soul. What were once just small, disconcerting gestures have now become clear attitudes of control. One day, walking down the corridor of my house, I glanced at the mirror in the living room. He was there, behind me, but not the way it should be. He looked at me with a deep, fixed and intense look, as if he was expecting something from me. The feeling of being watched was no longer just uncomfortable. It was now unbearable, threatening. My heart was beating hard, and I stopped, frozen in place. The reflection made a slow movement, as if studying me. He seemed to understand my fear, knew I was blind with dread, and he fed on it. I needed to get out of there. I needed to move away, but my legs seemed heavy, as if the mirror was pulling me, as if there were no way out of it. The night came, and I knew it was time to face me again. I knew that when I looked in the mirror before sleeping, the vision I would have was no longer a simple reflection. It would be a creature, a shadow that was beginning to consume me, wanting to take my place. I hesitated to approach the mirror. Everything inside me screamed not to do this, but something deeper pulled me there. When I looked, my breath was suspended. The reflection was not just watching me, it was copying me, but in a way that made my blood freeze. Every movement of mine was perfectly replicated, but at the same time it was becoming more distorted. Every gesture, every expression I made, seemed to stretch out and turn into something grotesque in the mirror. His smile was now bigger than mine, as if he was becoming stronger and more real, more alive. I felt my stomach wrap. My reflex was beginning to dominate me, and I didn't know how to fight it. I was losing control of my own identity. More and more, he distorted himself and became a worse version of myself, until there was no way to separate my image from his. And the feeling of being swallowed, of losing who I was, intensified with each look. It was as if he was taking my life. One night, after a long day of work, I was in front of the mirror trying, without success, to prepare myself for sleep. I was so exhausted that my eyes could barely keep open. When I unintentionally let my mind wander, my vision blurred. Stood there, looking at my blurred image in the mirror. When my eyes focused again, I realized something that made my heart stop. The reflection was no longer there. He was out of the mirror. I took a step back, almost falling, and then he turned to me. It was no longer the reflection that imitated my movements. He was acting on his own. The reflection was outside the mirror, standing as real as I am. He smiled, and that smile was not of pleasure or fun. It was a smile of possession, as if he knew that he had finally caught me. I screamed. I tried to run, but my legs were weak. My mind was completely out of control. My reflection was now in front of me, a distorted replica of myself, like a shadow that had come to life. I was blind from fear, but somewhere deep, a part of me knew. The reflection didn't just want to look at me. It wanted to replace me. I no longer knew what was real. Everything around me seemed distorted, as if the mirror had absorbed the essence of everything I knew. The reflection was here, before me, but it was no longer just an image. He was outside the mirror with the same features, the same appearance, but there was something in him that wasn't mine, something evil, something that wanted to destroy me. I tried to scream, but the voice did not come out. I was paralyzed with fear. My legs did not move, and my mind was in a whirlwind of confused thoughts. The creature in front of me, which would once be my copy, now smiled maliciously as if it had one. The reflection looked at me with an empty look, a look that said he had been patient, that he had waited for this moment. He watched me with pleasure, as one who watches his prey being slowly consumed. What happened next was a sequence of distorted sensations, as if time had broken apart. I was aware of every movement, but it was as if my mind was being dragged into a dark place where there was no return. The reflection began to advance, and in its movement, I realized that there was no escape. With each step he took towards me, the environment around me seemed to disappear, as if the mirror was taking everything back. I fought with all my might, trying to run, but couldn't. I didn't know if I was running in the mirror or in the real world. The reflection was surrounding me, his eyes no longer imitating mine, but watching me with a malignant pleasure. I felt absorbed, as if he was sucking my soul. "You were always weak," the voice of the reflection sounded, soft but full of disdain. I didn't know if it was my mind that was talking or if he was really talking, but it made my blood cold. He knew who I was, knew my weaknesses. He had studied me, and now he was ready to take my place. It was at that moment that something happened. An explosion of clarity. I remembered something my mind had forgotten until then. A small but vital detail. The reflection could not exist without me. It was attached to me. If I did not move, he would not move either. If I did not feed him with my energy, he would be immobile, without power. I looked at him, taking a deep breath, trying to concentrate. The reflection, with that smile of victory, did not seem to understand what was happening. He moved on, but something started to change. I was getting a little control back, just a little. With all the strength that was left in me, I made the simplest movement of all. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the reflection stopped. He was there, motionless, as if frozen in time, a distorted replica of me. I knew that if I just kept my eyes closed long enough, maybe I could block your presence. Perhaps he was forced to return where he came from. With a tremendous effort, I closed my eyes once more, stronger, with all my will. I didn't want to see that thing anymore. I didn't want to feel the weight of fear. I didn't know if it would be enough, but it was all I could do. I concentrated on my breath, on the simple act of existing, and then silence. When I finally opened my eyes, there was nothing left. The reflection was back in its place in the mirror, still and immobile, as it should always be. There was no sign of him. He had disappeared, as if he had never existed, as if he had dissolved into the air. I looked at myself in the mirror, and everything seemed normal again. I was alone finally. There was no more that malicious smile. There was no more that threatening presence. But something inside me knew the mirror would never be the same. I didn't know if the reflection was really out of me or if it waited patiently, waiting for the right moment to try again. I felt his presence, a shadow in the back of my mind, telling me that I had just postponed what was coming. I moved away from the mirror, slowly, with my heart still beating. I wasn't sure that I had one, but for now it was enough. I was free, at least for now. But as I left the room, a detail made me stop. The reflection in the mirror. He was no longer looking at me. He was looking back. He was looking at the door, and I knew, no doubt, that he was waiting. Luke watched the house before him, with the lights out and the windows closed, giving it a gloomy and desolate appearance. The wind rocked lightly the trees in the garden, and a feeling of emptiness hovered in the air, as if the house, once a home, was now just waiting to be forgotten. He gave a deep sigh before opening the gate with a familiar, but now bewildering creak. With each step towards the door, he felt more disconnected from that place. That house, with its familiar corners and memories, now seemed unrecognizable. The sound of the lock spinning sounded like a final sentence, as if, upon entering, he was sealing his fate in that empty space. Upon entering, a wave of nostalgia enveloped him, mixed with a shiver that made him tremble involuntarily. The house still had traces of his previous life, the couch where they sat to watch movies on Sundays, the dining table where they shared laughter and conversations, and the rooms where both he and Anna had laid. But now everything was different. The walls, which were once covered with photos and memories, were bare. The windows were open, letting the cold breeze in and moving the curtains like bright shadows. Silence was deafening. Lucas felt disoriented. He knew that separation was inevitable, but to spend the night there in the house he once called home was like a test of his sanity. The loneliness seemed immense, a burden he was not prepared to carry. Tried to put these thoughts away, concentrating on the routine. He took the spare key, locked the door behind him, and placed the suitcase in the corner of the room. "It's just one night," he repeated to himself, trying to convince himself that it was only a step to deal with the end of the marriage. What else could he do? Staying in a hotel wouldn't help. He felt that he needed to feel the house, breathe his air, as if it would help him understand what had happened with his life. He sat on the couch, leaning his back against the old cushion that still smelled like coffee that he and Anna used to make together in the morning. But at that moment, it seemed that the smell was distant, unrecognizable. The sound of their own sighs mixed with the silence that filled the spaces of the house. As he looked up at the ceiling, trying to organize his thoughts, the environment began to seem more dense, as if the house was watching him. An uncomfortable feeling settled in his chest, but he forced the mind to calm down. It was just loneliness, the mind playing tricks. He was tired, and that was just the weight of the separation. He took another breath and tried to get used to the emptiness around him. Still, something in the house looked different. Something was out of place, but he couldn't identify what it was. The shadows on the walls seemed denser, more restless, as if the house was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. The feeling persisted as night began to fall. The clock on the wall of the room marked 10 p.m., and Lucas felt the weight of the night begin to drag. He got up from the couch and walked around the house, trying to keep his restless thoughts away. Maybe it was the lack of routine or the unbearable silence, but there was something in that place that made him nervous. Every step he took seemed to be amplified, as if the house was listening, responding to his movement. As she passed through the kitchen, the light from the refrigerator blinked briefly, and a shiver ran down her spine. He looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The sound of the wind beating on the windows seemed even louder, as if the house was trying to communicate in some way. Luke shook his head. "It's just your head, Luke," he said in a low voice, trying to push away the thoughts. "You're alone here, and that's what's scaring you." He went up the stairs in order to go to the room and try to sleep. But before he got up, a soft sound, but distinct, made him stop in the middle of the way. A step, a clear and audible sound, as if someone had stepped on the floor above. He froze, his muscles tense. He looked up at the top of the ladder, but it was dark. Nothing moved. His heart began to beat faster, and he forced his mind to calm down. Maybe it was the floor, he thought, or maybe a noise coming from outside. But then the sound repeated itself. One more step. He stepped back, his mind trying to make sense of what was happening. It was impossible. The house was empty. He knew it. There was no one else there besides him. Or maybe he was imagining everything. His separation, the change, the weight of loneliness. Maybe all this was affecting your perception. He went up to the top floor, a feeling of anxiety growing with each step. Each step seemed heavier than the previous one. In the hall, the sound of his own breathing echoed on the walls, and he could barely hear the noises coming from somewhere far away. As he passed the double room, now empty and lifeless, the memories there mixing with the cold and impersonal air dash. He heard a whisper, weak, but as clear as the sound of his own voice. Lucas, the king. The whispered name made his body shiver. He stopped immediately, eyes wide, trying to understand what he had just heard. The surrounding air seemed thicker, and the silence of the house more charged. He looked around, but there was no one. The whisper seemed to come from all sides, but there was no presence. It was your mind, Lucas, he whispered to himself, trying to ignore what he had just heard. You're hearing things, that's all. He took a few steps, but before he could move away, a loud and clear beat resonated on the wall to his left, followed by another and another, as if someone was knocking on the door of one of the rooms. But when he looked, the doors were closed, and the house was silent again. Fear was beginning to infiltrate his mind. The sound was real, couldn't be his imagination. He walked to the guest room, where the windows were open, and the wind had made the curtains move, creating dancing shadows. But it wasn't the wind. There was something else. Something that was making the shadows move in a strange way. He left the room and moved away from the window, but the sound did not stop. The beats continued, stronger now, faster, as if they were approaching. Lucas' heart exploded, and he could no longer tell whether it was real or a product of his growing fear. He thought of calling someone, anyone, but who could understand? Who would see him as anything but a nervous man, dealing with the traces of a life he was trying to leave behind? It was when he heard something even more disturbing. Steps coming from inside the house, slowly but steadily, as if someone was approaching him in the corridor. Without thinking, he turned and ran up the stairs, but upon reaching the top, the feeling that someone was in the house with him became so real that he could almost feel the breath of someone behind him. He looked back, but there was no one. The corridor was empty, more empty than ever. Lucas could no longer control the panic that was taking over his body. His chest tightened, and his breathing became more and more difficult. The beats, the whispers, the steps, everything seemed to concentrate around him, creating an oppressive feeling that something was watching. He clenched his fists, trying to stay rational, but his body was at war with his mind. With his legs shaking, he walked away from the ladder and looked around, looking for something, anything, that would make him feel like he was still in control. But the house looked distorted. The air was thick, as if the walls had closed in, and the shadows, before harmless, now seemed to stretch out and writhe, taking strange forms. Suddenly, the corridor in front of him seemed to extend, as if the environment was distorting itself, growing, until he found himself completely isolated in the center of the house. The dim light of the corridor lamp flickered, creating a frenetic dance of shadows that moved in impossible ways. It was then that he saw her. A shadowy, indistinct, and nebulous figure appeared at the end of the corridor. It was a floating presence, as if it was partially dematerialized, but still visible. The figure seemed without form, like a living shadow, with a human silhouette, but its contours were fluid, almost as if it merged with the darkness itself. She was standing still, watching him. There were no clear details, just the feeling of a being waiting, a being that should not be there. Lucas tried to scream, but his throat was tight. He found himself trapped, unable to move. Fear took hold of him, paralyzing him. He wanted to run, but his legs did not respond. The eyes of the figure, if they were eyes, seemed to shine with a cold light, as beacons that called him, attracted him. He could not look away. It can't be real, he thought, the empty words echoing in his mind. That can't be real. The figure began to move slowly towards him, dragging with heavy and slow steps. Luke, unable to look away, felt the air become heavier, as if sinking into a layer of ice. Every step the figure took, more the house seemed to succumb to absolute silence, as if time had stopped. The surrounding sounds disappeared, and he could only hear his heart beating furiously in his chest. When the figure was only a few meters away, she stopped. The corridor seemed to narrow, as if the house was squeezing it against the wall. Lucas felt the pressure increase, and the tension was unbearable. He wanted to speak, shout, ask for help, but his voice was locked inside him. The figure seemed to be waiting, expecting something from him. Suddenly the figure moved again, faster now, and Luke, in a desperate reflex, finally found the strength to move. He stepped back, tripped, and fell to the ground with a deaf thump. The figure came even closer, now so close that he could feel the cold air of his presence. Panic enveloped him like a crushing wave. He could no longer discern what was real and what was an invention of his mind. Fear dominated him, and he felt as if his own sanity was about to crumble. When he tried to get up, something made him stop. The figure, before indistinct, now seemed clearer, more solid, and with a movement almost imperceptible, she raised her hand, pointing at him. There were no words, but the feeling was unmistakable. The figure wanted him to come to her. It was a call, silent but intense, a command he did not know how to resist. Luke closed his eyes for a moment, trying to move away from the scene, but as he opened his eyes again, the figure was even closer, almost within reach. She no longer had the imprecise shape he had seen before. Now her contours were defined, but still she seemed wrapped in a dark mist. His eyes, if they were eyes, were fixed on him, and it seemed that everything he knew, all of his reality, was crumbling, dissolving in the darkness. The fear, now totally unbearable, made Lucas rise up, but before he could take another step, the figure disappeared, leaving a deep cold in the air. The house was quiet again. Only now something was different. The presence was still there, like an invisible mark in the air, and Lucas knew he wasn't alone anymore. The figure hadn't gone away. She was waiting for him, lurking in the darkness. Lucas crawled to the center of the room, weak knees and feet sliding on the cold floor. The panic that once seemed like a storm now turned into a cold nightmare, burying him deeper and deeper in a sense of powerlessness. He tried desperately to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense. The clock on the wall seemed to mark time in ever longer intervals, each ticking echoing in the emptiness of the house. He felt as if the house was swallowing the sound around, as if the space itself had become a prison. Every breath he took seemed to be swallowed by a deep and heavy silence, so dense that he could hardly hear his own thoughts. Sitting on the floor, mind-numbed, Luke tried to get up, but his body still trembled. He forced himself to walk to the door, the only way he felt he could lead to freedom, to the exit of that house. But as soon as she reached the door, it did not give way. The handle rotated, but the door was locked, as if an invisible force had sealed it. The feeling of claustrophobia increased. He was trapped inside that house with something he did not understand, something that watched him, waiting for him. The air seemed thicker now, and Lucas could not breathe properly. Every movement he made was slow, forced, as if time were slowing down, making everything more difficult. He returned to the center of the room and, in an impulsive act, shouted. Not a cry of anger, but a cry of despair. He screamed as if his soul was trying to free itself. But the house responded with an absolute silence, overwhelming. The only sound left was the sound of his own panting breath, filling the emptiness around him. It was at this moment that he heard the whisper again. Soft, almost imperceptible, like a breeze passing through his skin. But this time he was not just a distant whisper. He seemed to come from within his own house, from his own home that had now become a being, an entity, watching him in every corner, in every shadow. Lucas, the king. The sound of his own name made his stomach turn. He looked around, but there was no one, nothing. The house was as empty as before, but the weight of the presence of the figure still hovered in the air. That name, that whisper, seemed to call him back, as if something was waiting for him, where it all began, at the end of the hall. But he didn't know if he was ready to face it. He looked down the hall once more, and there she was, the figure, now more defined than ever, as a dark, solid shadow, shaped like a human being, but with an indistinct face, blurred, as if it was a distorted reflection of something he did not want to recognize. She was standing still, as if she had always been there, waiting for his return. Lucas wanted to run, he wanted to get out of there, but his body did not respond. He felt his feet stuck to the ground, as if the house itself was trapping him, holding him in place. The fear involved him in a new, deeper way. It was not only the fear of being attacked, but the fear of being called. As if the figure was inviting him to approach, as if she knew something about him, something he wasn't ready to know. The whisper repeated itself, this time stronger, more urgent. Lucas, the king. The figure then began to walk slowly towards her, the steps gentle but full of a silent power. She did not hurry, but did not stop. With every step she took, Luke felt the tension clenching around him, as if he was being pulled towards her, drawn by a force he could not comprehend. The figure stopped a few meters from him. Now, with his defined contours and a gloomy glow in her eyes, she stared at him without speaking. Her look, if we could call it looking, was empty, but also loaded with something that Lucas did not want to face. He knew that somehow she was waiting for a reaction, hoping he would do something. And then, with a muffled sigh, the figure said, in a voice so low that it seemed to be an extension of the silence around, "You can't run away." These words fell on him like a sentence. The fear hit him with a brutal force, and he finally gave in, fell to his knees on the ground. Everything was dark now. The walls closed, the figure came even closer, and he knew there was no escape. He was stuck in a nightmare, and the house, the figure, everything was mixing into something that he could not understand. With a last look, the figure disappeared into the darkness, and Luke stood there alone, not knowing if the presence he felt was real or a construction of his mind. But as he stood there, waiting for the morning that would never come, he knew that something had changed forever, something he could never understand. The house, now permanently empty, kept whispering, and he knew that the next time someone entered that place, it would not be just an empty house waiting to be inhabited. She had already become something else, and Lucas somehow became part of it.